Long before J.J. Abrams took up the call to war in 2015, there's been rumours about Star Wars Episode VII going back decades. Basically, if the internet had been around when the Return of the Jedi was just wrapping up, we probably would have been hearing something akin to the calls for the Snyder Cut all the way back then. With that, I'm Sean Ferrick for What Culture Star Wars, and here are 8 different versions of Star Wars Episode VII that were almost made. Number 8. A non-Lucas follow-up in the 80s. When Return of the Jedi finished and it was all done and Vader was lying there toasting away like barbecue, George Lucas was finished. Now, while there were treatments for sequels, which we will get to later on, he felt that the story had been told. He then felt that potentially it was time to step away. He would become busy with the Indiana Jones trilogy and Howard the Duck, and potentially, if the latter hadn't done the business that it did, he might never have been interested to revisit the Star Wars franchise again. He did say for a while that there was absolutely no chance of sequels and that it wasn't happening and that Star Wars was done, and then Disney came by with a bit of a check. And I mean, I guess that's not what he said at all, and you can't prove that. 7. A 4th film in the overarching series after Return of the Jedi. Now, way back when they were still producing the original idea for the Star Wars trilogy, it wasn't a trilogy. Or at least, it wasn't a trilogy in the way that it ended up becoming. George Lucas said that there was always going to be 9 parts to this saga, and Gary Kurtz was able to give a little bit more direction on what might have been. Now, for example, the original envisaged Episode 6 did not feature the Emperor. Vader did still die at the end, but the end of the film would see Luke Skywalker zooming off into the galaxy on a sort of a spiritual journey, but also to go and find his sister, who wouldn't be Leia. They stated that this version of Episode 7 would be more of an ethereal film, something that would be less action-oriented and more focused on the Skywalker clan. However, when they were doing pre-production on Return of the Jedi, the decision was made to tie a lot of these ideas together in a tighter bunch, which is why Leia became a Skywalker and why the Emperor was brought in as soon as he was. 6. A sequel trilogy instead of a prequel trilogy. This idea was planned way back while they were still filming the original trilogy, and in fact the idea has stemmed from a conversation between George Lucas and Mark Hamill on set. This idea, Lucas said, would follow an older Luke Skywalker who would be in a sort of an Obi-Wan-esque role in wherever he ended up being. Now, George Lucas's biographer, Dave Pollock, actually read the treatments for the original 12-part saga as it was, but he was bound by a confidentiality statement for quite a long time. Until 2012, in fact. Having said that, he didn't reveal very much when he was able to finally talk about it. He did say that back during the original trilogy, the plan had been for Luke to be in his 30s or 40s, which would have meant that the sequel trilogy was aimed to be produced and released in the 1990s, which of course is when the prequel trilogy was released. Ish. It also said that some of the slightly more superfluous elements of the prequel trilogy could have been put into a sequel trilogy. Now, for example, Darth Maul is not exactly essential in the prequel trilogy and could very easily have been brought forward into the sequel trilogy. And alright, we're pretty much just saying this because how unbelievable would it have been to see Luke Skywalker fighting Darth Maul? Come on! 5. A David Fincher directed Force Awakens. When Disney bought the rights to Lucasfilm in 2012, everyone was immediately abuzz with, okay, what's happening now? There was no question as to whether or not there would be an Episode 7, but just what shape it was going to take. There was immediate discussions about who potentially would be cast in the film, but just as loud there was discussions of who would be the director. Now, one of the only things that was certain was that George Lucas was out. It was not going to be him. And in fact, it was revealed that Disney approached David Fincher to direct Episode 7. Disney, of course, were looking at the fact that this guy had delivered hit after hit after hit and would be a fantastic person to have behind the camera. But Fincher was unlikely to say yes to this project because of the horrendous time he had had on Alien 3. Now, while Alien was at the time not a property of Disney, he had plenty of experience of studios meddling in the creative process. With the amount that Disney had put towards the Star Wars franchise, it was incredibly unlikely that they were going to give a director creative control. And in fact, Fincher's idea was that if he was going to do it, he wanted to explore the droids. You know, this subclass of sentient robots who were condemned to servitude. Disney had other ideas. 4. A non-Disney, Lucas-directed version of The Force Awakens. Now, this idea, this was before, obviously, it was sold to Disney. And this was when Lucas was starting to come around to the idea of coming back to the Star Wars franchise. While he had maintained for a long time that come what may, there was not going to be sequel films despite the previous treatments, he started changing his mind, and in fact, there was a very simple thing that seemed to stop him. It was time. Creating a trilogy was going to take the better part of a decade, and that is a hell of a commitment for any filmmaker to take on. Now, at this time as well, Disney was beginning to start sniff around and go, well, we'll take it off your hands for you. And also CEO Bob Iger said it was one of the pinnacles of his career if he was able to get Star Wars. Lucas relented, and he included the treatments that he had written as part of the sale. We'll come back to that. 3. The Force Awakens, but focusing on the new cast. One of the very first names involved in this new version of Star Wars was Michael Arndt, who'd been screenwriter of Little Miss Sunshine and Toy Story 3, both of which had been successful. He wanted to take the series in a new direction. Now, this new direction would have focused primarily on new characters as opposed to relying so heavily on returning characters to the franchise. Disney, however, were a little bit unsure with this one because they needed Force Awakens to be a hit. Lawrence Kasdan, who had of course been one of the bigwigs on Empire Strikes Back, was brought in to replace Michael Arndt. And to be honest, they sort of kept some of the ideas. If you look at The Force Awakens as it ended up being, you will see that while Han Solo has a very large role, Luke's role is more of he's a plot device as opposed to a character, and Leia has a small enough role, whereas Rey, Finn and Poe all get considerable screen time. 2. The Empire Strikes Back. Yep, you heard that one right. The Empire Strikes Back was originally going to be Episode 7, but this is back when the saga was a 12-part series. Here's how it roughly would have broken down. You would have had Episode 1, which would have been a prelude. Episodes 2, 3 and 4 would have focused on the Clone Wars, as were mentioned in the original film. 5 would have been a bit of a bridge between the Old Republic and the New Empire. 6, 7 and 8 would have been the trilogy as it came to become, putting 7 as The Empire Strikes Back. 9, 10 and 11 would be an as yet undisclosed sequel trilogy, with 12 being something of an epilogue to the whole saga. This changed during the writing of Empire Strikes Back because certain places, characters and events, they moved all over the place, which meant to leave events such as the Emperor or even the big twist to so late in the series changed the meaning of the series. The reveal of Vader being Anakin Skywalker meant this was not just an action-packed space opera, this was a family drama that was split over all of these different films. Number 1, a Disney-produced version that used Lucas's script. When Disney took over Lucasfilm, they inherited Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and Sam and Max. But Lucas made a very loud point of saying it wasn't just the Star Wars franchise as it had been that they had picked up, they had also picked up the treatments for the sequel trilogy. Now, Disney were quick to attempt to allay fans of Star Wars by saying, don't worry, we're going to use these treatments, or at least we're going to use them as inspiration. You know, you will keep the spirit of Star Wars alive in these very important treatments that we're certainly not just going to toss in the bin. Guess what they did? While these treatments were cooling their heels in the bin, J.J. Abrams and the crew behind The Force Awakens began working on their own direction with the franchise. Now, I wouldn't be too worried George Lucas wasn't too upset with this. It might have something to do with the $4.05 billion check that he received, and I have it on good authority that, that'll make you feel pretty good. Now, if you can think of anything that we might have missed in this list, please let us know in the comments below. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Now, you can catch us over on Twitter at WhatCulture. You can catch myself over on Twitter at Sean Ferrick. Do whatever you can to make sure that you're happy. Look after yourself, look after your friends and family, and may the Force be with you.